Hi everyone, my name is Ed Kless and we're here today to talk about initiating a project in a small organization. Thanks for joining me today. The particulars are up on the screen right now. If you want to get a hold of me, ed.kless@sage.com is also a good way, but Twitter or just hit my website, which is a radio show that I do for Sage called thesoulofenterprise.com. Let's jump right in, and we're going to talk today about project initiation. And before we begin on initiation, I have a couple things that I want to share with you by way of background. We're dropping ourselves down to in the middle of things here, and in medias res, as the Romans would say. And I think it's important for us to take just a very brief few minutes to define some terminology before we get into the guts, the nuts and bolts of this thing called initiation. The first thing is to note that when you are trying to evolve a project management methodology in your organization, you shouldn't start with the methodology and work downward. I think this is a big mistake that organizations tend to make, and that is they say we need to standardize methodology across the board. They define that standard methodology and then insist that everybody else in the organization adapt it. Doesn't really work all that well. It's oftentimes a disaster. Where you really have to start is in the notion of common language. So do we define things the same way? Do we have a common set of terms that we're using? Plato said, all wisdom begins with the definition of terms. So let's start with one. Let's define project, right? A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. It's pretty straightforward. Temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. And what this means is it's temporary, and second, that the thing has to be unique. We don't have like these processes inside our organization to do projects because they are, by definition, a little bit unique. But here's where we want to go with this, and that is understanding what is different about project initiation versus planning. So this diagram here, and this is directly from the Project Management Institute and their thing called the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. And this is a graphic that illustrates what the Project Management Institute knows as their 5 main process groups, or 5 process groups: initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. And about the only thing that you can say with certainty about this is that initiating comes before closing. I know, I'm a genius, right? Point being is you see this amorphous kind of amoeboid monitoring, controlling that surrounds everything, and that can happen early on in a project that you're using monitoring, controlling processes. But let's just say this though, what we want to make sure is that initiating clearly has to come before project planning, and they're distinct and separate things. And I think this is one of the things that is oftentimes left out in projects, the fact that we first have to properly initiate a project inside an organization before we truly begin the planning process. And this is the thing that's left out. Now I've got a graphic that I'll show you in a few minutes that I think really illustrates this home. By the way, on the left-hand side of this graph, you see the inputs, tools, and techniques, and outputs. Each of the 5 process groups over on the right side has a series of these inputs, tools, and techniques, and outputs for each of those 5. What we're going to be talking about today is specifically the output of the initiating process. I'm going to give you some hints about some of the other things, the inputs and the tools and techniques, but we're going to spend the bulk of our time focused on this thing that is the output of this initiating process, not planning process. All right. Next up, just want to show you again why this is so important. And this is a graph that illustrates a characteristic of projects. They are said to be progressively elaborative. In other words, we learn more and more about what the thing is that we're trying to do as we move through the project itself. And this is why this 0 that you see in the middle here, this is the deviation from the baseline, the original prediction of what the costs were going to be and or the benefits going to be. So we're going to see some deviation based on this. And way back in initiating, you can see there's a pretty significant deviation. There's a chance that, it's going to cost us 75% more or even double what we originally estimate, or it could cost us less. It never costs less, but let's just pretend. So it could be significantly higher than what we talk about in initiation. And this is one of the reasons why what these planning documents are so important. important. One of the outcomes is in our cost-benefit analysis, which we don't have time for. We want to make sure that the benefit significantly outweighs the cost, just in case we get involved in a situation where the costs end up being double and maybe even triple what we think they're going to be. We want to make sure that the benefits far outweigh those, to the point where maybe they're 3, 4, 5, even 10 times higher than the perceived cost. But again, that's another story, and we've got a lot to talk about with regard to just project initiation and the project initiation outcome document. So we're going to get into that. Here's the proof. Here's the proof in the pudding, if you will, of why this is, I think, one of the biggest mistakes that's made in project management. SMB, IT, RFF. Okay, small and medium business, information technology projects, reasons for failure. So SMB, IT, RFF, but small and medium business, IT-related projects. This is the data, the research that's come back. And this is what we've learned. And this is a long-standing survey that was conducted by the Standish Group for years and years and years and years. And this is the latest data set on this, that cite that the number one reason for projects, small and medium-sized business, IT-related projects failing is that the senior executives have failed to buy in to the project. And you can see it's 27%. Now, by the way, this is a multi-select question, so you could give multiple reasons for the failure of the project on the survey, and there are far more values than just these 5. I'm just showing you the top 5. But you can see that the number one, is significantly higher than the second, which is vendor over promises. I mean, to the point where it's, if I have a quick guess here, 25-ish, 27% higher than the next one, which is vendor over promises. So if we've identified clearly here the number one reason for failure, well, maybe we ought to take some precautions against that. And what are the things that we can put in place to make sure that the number one reason for failure doesn't affect our particular project? And the way that we're going to do this is, I think, through proper project initiation. Now, we're going to focus on this document called the Project Charter, and I'm going to go into great detail with you about this document for the remaining time with our conversation. But just briefly, I think there are 2 other important documents that you should look at. One is called the Feasibility Analysis, which simply asks this question. If I could distill it down to one question, it would be this: is this feasible? In other words, can we do this? Is it possible that we even could do it? Is it feasible at all? Now, there's a little bit more to it than that, but ultimately that's the question that you're trying to ask. And then there's the cost-benefit analysis, which I alluded to earlier, which, if I could distill this down to one question, would be this: should we do this project? The first one, the feasibility, is can we do this project? The feasibility, the cost benefit says, should we do this? In other words, is there an economic benefit? Is there a justification business-wise for us moving forward with this project? And that's what's got to be built in the cost benefit analysis. Those 2 things precede the project charter. Again, we don't have time to talk about those today. We're going to focus mostly on the output of this process called the Project Charter. But take a look at these 2 documents. And by the way, yes, you can get copies of these. Send an email to ed.kless@sage.com and just say Project Initiation in the subject line. And I'll know exactly what you're talking about. And I will send you a copy of these 3 documents: the feasibility analysis, the cost benefit, and the Project Charter as well. But let's look, with the time that we have remaining, we're going to look in detail at the Project Charter. Now, this requires me to do a little magic here and switch over to Microsoft Word, because that's where this document is. So I believe that's up on the screen now, and now I need to get it on my screen, which would be helpful. And there we are. Okay, so here's the Project Charter. And we're just going to take a look and go through some of the details on this. The first thing that you'll see is the executive summary, right? It's one sentence here at the end, talks about that we're formally authorizing this, and that here's the reason for us doing this. All of these inputs, this main reason, actually comes from the feasibility analysis. So that's what I'm saying. Those are really input documents to this. You could, in a certain sense, start with the project charter if you've answered the first two questions that I alluded to earlier in the affirmative. Can we do this? Yes, we can. Should we do this? Yes, we should. If you have clear and convincing evidence, at least in your mind, you can skip over those two and go directly here to the project charter. So what's the main reason? Why are we doing this? So that's what we're putting in the executive summary. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to define the two key stakeholders in the project. And the first one that we're going to define is the executive sponsor. Now, notice that this statement begins with I, executive sponsor. The author of this document is the executive sponsor. And that's a very critically important point, and we'll see where this plays in. Now, you can dispense with some of maybe my formalized language around this, but I think it's important to have I, executive sponsor, and understand that, hey, this is being done by the person who's doing this. Now, I have this in a Microsoft Word document. Does it have to be in Word? No, of course not. This, you could cut and paste this text, put it into an email format, and that could certainly serve as the project charter. There's no reason to kill trees, but it's just the easiest way for me to explain it is to have this Word document ready to go. So, executive sponsor and who that person is, what their title is. Notice, my role will be to ensure the ultimate success and mentor the project manager, who we're going to define later. I am the person who's going to sign off on all planning documents and change requests. So we are going to put a plan together at some point in the future, and I'm the one who's going to sign off on that as saying, yes, the company agrees that this is what we're going to do. And if there's a change for any reason, I'm going to be the one to sign off on that as well. So, and here's where you can reach me. Any questions? Yes, I know you can put this in CRM systems and all that, but I like to have it in one place, just my personal preference. The second person that we're going to define is the project manager, the person who is going to be the project manager in this case. So-and-so will be the project manager. Here's a key sentence. As a result, they are authorized to plan and conduct project activities and make necessary expenditures within the approved budget of X. Now, the budget doesn't have to be the budget for the entire project. It could be a smaller pool of money for the investigation and going through and properly initiating and maybe even doing the planning of the project, and then a final determination is made with regard to budget moving forward. So I think you can do that both ways. But, important point here, I want you to say that, look, this isn't going to happen for free. There's got to be some authority given to the project manager to spend some kind of money. By the way, quick hint here, if the person that you're designating as the project manager is someone that you don't trust with money, probably shouldn't trust them with the project either. Just a little tidbit there. That would not be a good idea. So all of the language here is important, because if it makes you think, if it gives you pause as to who the person is and why, you might want to take a step back and think, oh, maybe we want to rethink who we should give this project to. So we're going to give this person the authority to plan and make some necessary expenditures. And we'll see why this sentence is important, because it's tied to something a little bit later. And then to achieve the project objectives, they will be assembling an initial project team, and here's where they can be reached, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so now we have the two key stakeholders defined. We have the executive sponsor defined, and we have our project manager defined. Great, so we're ready to move forward now and talk a little bit about the initial project team. Notice that we don't have to define necessarily who these people are right now. It's possible that you could, but for the most part, it's just important that we define that there will be an initial team that's going to do this. So let's talk about some of the language here and why this is important. It will consist of X number of people. Maybe you've determined that, or you could say 3 to 5, or 3 to 10, whatever number. It certainly can be a range here, taken from different areas of the company. Perhaps we're going to pull in and get a cross-functional team together to do this. Here's the key sentence in this, though. If you are called to serve on this team, please do so knowing that you have the approval of management. That is me, the executive sponsor. So here's the sentence. And then the next thing, if you feel you cannot serve due to time concerns, please let me and your maybe immediate manager know that, and we'll help you reassess your current priorities. The point here is that this project team, let's call him Fred the project manager. If Fred comes to you and says, hey, listen, I lead you to serve on this project team or the initiation team for this project that we're doing. Pretend that it's the executive sponsor asking you, because I have entrusted my authority to Fred. And if Fred comes to you, pretend it's me asking you. So this really gives Fred a little bit more oomph, right, behind this to say, hey, listen, now, if you're Fred and the person that you're asking to, the VP of sales that says, sorry, I can't make the meeting Tuesday, but I can make it Thursday. You don't go run into the executive sponsor saying, well, you said you couldn't make it until Thursday. No, right? Some reasonable period of time. What we're looking to do here is just make sure that no one is going to come at you with full-throated, full-on resistance and not want to participate and delay. So this is what the sentence that does this. Okay. Now, next paragraph is pretty interesting as well. If you are not asked to serve on this team, please do not think it is because your input is not wanted. Ultimately, it's our intention to get feedback from everybody. It's still early in the process, etc. Notice that the language here is speaking to folks who, might not be necessarily named in this document or might not be on the project team. And that's exactly correct. And the reason why we're doing this is that this is something that should be communicated out to the entire organization. Especially, this is where we're talking about here, a small organization. If you're a part of a larger organization, I still think that communication is important. However, you don't necessarily have to send an email or this document out to 50,000 people in the company. But maybe, the closest, tightest circle of 20, 50, or 100 who might want to know or should know that this project is going on or is about to start, is about to be initiated. One of the things I think is important is this sets the stage for further and better communication throughout the process when we say that we're going to communicate well and effectively early on. Now, I was involved in a project once, and as I was an outside consultant coming in, and this was before I started using some documents like this, overheard a really interesting conversation one time about me. And it was a whole kind of cubicle set up, so they didn't know that I was in earshot. They're like, who's this guy, Ed? I think we're getting bought. No, it wasn't the case at all. We were just going to be implementing a new accounting system. That was really not that big a deal. But this is why I think it's important for us to communicate with everybody in the organization. Know, hey, this guy and I was an outside project manager in this particular case. This is why he's going to be snooping around, asking questions, maybe of not you just yet, but be prepared for it. Okay, so I think that's one of the clear important points of this. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of this document. Now, much of this would come from your feasibility analysis as well, but since we didn't have time to go through that, I'm going to cheat a little bit and talk about some of these things that would be inputs that we really would probably just cut and paste from a feasibility document and instead drop in here. So the next section I should talk about is this notion of the business needs. So again, 2 or 3 sentences to describe what prompted what was the reason for this happening? Why do we think we need to do whatever this project is supposed to do? What endeavor are we undertaking and what's the rationale for it? So we need to describe that. We probably should include in here some very high level estimates of benefit. We think if we do this is going to help us save $50,000 a quarter or $200,000 a year or whatever you feel comfortable saying. But there should be some kind of a target in here to say, hey, this is what ultimately we're looking. So this is where you can incorporate stuff like that. Next up, we want to make sure that we also have what is the product, service, or knowledge that's needed here. Right, so what's our need? The product, service, or knowledge needed. So first is the business need, and then the next thing that we're going to talk about is, so what are the things that we're going to do? What are the critical characteristics of whatever we need that's going to be in place here? And sometimes it's just additional knowledge. Important point here. Sometimes what we're doing with a project is just seeking outside counsel and understanding of what should be going on. So just be on the lookout. I think more and more as we get into knowledge work, we realize that not always are the projects that we're doing related to some kind of a service or even product that we're doing, but it's sometimes just additional outside knowledge. Next, what are our known issues? So click and describe any problems that this project is expected to fix, or, and this is probably the better way of thinking about it, the desired results, right? What are the desired results of the project? Next up, constraints. Now, constraints are interesting because I think they are another thing that is oftentimes misunderstood by a lot of people who don't do project management for a living. So restraints are the barriers to completion. What are the things could get in the way of us doing it? However, we know what those things potentially are. So let me give you an example. If those of you old enough might remember, the Superstars, that was on ABC Sports. The more modern of you, the millennials of you, remember, the American Ninja, right? The obstacle course is really what metaphor that is what I'm going for here. So we have this obstacle course that the contestants need to work their way through. Okay. Now notice that all of the contestants, they know what the obstacles are. They know that they're going to have to shimmy back and forth from uneven pads that they have to jump across. They know they're going to have to climb up a wall, or they're going to have to work their way through some kind of monkey bar apparatus. They know what those things are, but they know they're in the way. Those are examples of constraints. All of those things in the obstacle course metaphor are the things that could get in the way of the athlete or the participant completing the obstacle course. So we want to just note those down. What are those things that we know? We're extraordinarily busy, or we know that we really got to get this project done before our busy season starts to kick in, because if our busy season kicks in, we know this is just going to get kicked to the back burner and get delayed. We might have an impending event in the organization. We know that so-and-so is leaving the company, so we have to make sure that this is done before then. So those are the types of things that you want to put in under constraints. Next, what are our assumptions? What do we assume to be or presume to be true, real, or correct? Now, I think that there's important things to think about in terms of assumptions, but there's a couple of overarching assumptions that I'd like you to just introduce to you quickly. The first one is that problem solving requires valid data. So if we're going to solve a problem, we need to get valid data about the problem. We can't withhold vital information from the project team unless we get that. Decision making requires free choice. This is the second assumption that I think is important, that if we're here to make decisions, we have to be free to choose. And even if the decision is no, that has to be on the table. And the last overarching assumption I think is important is that what we need to be committed to the process. So effective implementation requires commitment. That's the third assumption. Effective implementation requires commitment. Notice the operative word in all three of these assumptions was require. Not would be nice to need, it would be nice to have, but really that they're required. We must have this commitment. Here's a quick way to think about the difference between commitment and support, because oftentimes what I find is that there's a lot of support for projects, but not really commitment, and hence the number one reason for failure, right, being lack of commitment from the executive. So the difference between support and commitment is like bacon and eggs for breakfast. The chicken is supportive, the pig is committed. Skin in the game. We want full skin in the game here. And that's really the key to understanding that overcoming that number one reason for failure. And then, of course, the approval and the signature of the executive sponsor, or electronic signature, or tacit understanding that I have authorized this work, and say that work can begin, that we can start working on this project. Critical, again, that the executive sponsor be the ones that sends this. Now, the executive sponsor might not be involved in the day-to-day project down the road, but they are the ones who ultimately have the authority and, as you see from this document, successfully must transfer their authority over to the other person who is the project manager. I believe if you execute on this document, in most cases, certainly not all, you will overcome the number one reason for failure, and your projects overall will be much, much more successful. Thanks so much.